this is One. So today I'm out here at a local neighborhood cafe in Seoul, South Korea, just chilling with a ice Americano while trying to film an unscripted video. I'm doing this on the fly, so I hope you guys understand if I mumble a little bit. So today I picked up the M1 MacBook Air to test out its acclaimed greatness from the press. So when I say the press, I'm talking about YouTubers, of course. I wanted to experience the power of M1 with its coolest design, fanless design, cool temperature, all-day battery life, as well as performance that rivals the MacBook Pro 16 inches. Since I mainly use my MacBook Pro 16 inches at home for resource-intensive tasks, I wanted to mainly test out the M1 MacBook Air for its business functionality. And when I say business functionality, I'm talking about Microsoft Office and more specifically Microsoft Excel. And even more specifically, I wanted to answer the question if this ultra portable device could actually run the Windows version of the Microsoft Excel within the Parallels virtual PC environment. Now, many of you guys may argue that, the macOS version of the Microsoft Office is already available, but the Pro users prefer to use the Windows version since many of the keyboard shortcuts as well as some feature sets are not available on the macOS version. And these keyboard shortcuts are invaluable since they save a lot of time for Pro users. Let's cut to the chase and compare the Excel performance of the M1 MacBook Air against two other machines. The two machines I'll be benchmarking against will be my MacBook Pro 16 inches as well as a cloud virtual PC on the Microsoft Azure platform. My MacBook Pro 16 inches has a Core i9 8 cores with 32 gigs of RAM. Now, since I don't have my MacBook Pro 16 inches physically with me, I'll be remotely connecting to my MacBook Pro 16 inches with my iPad, and the Azure platform Cloud PC has two Xeon processor cores with 8 gigs of RAM. So let's get to it. Okay, so I needed an empirical method to measure the three systems' Excel performance, a method that measures performance in a quantifiable way. I'm going to use an Excel file from this website called IntenseWebs, which measures performance on any systems that can run Excel. It's a macro file. Let me pull it up here. It's a macro file with 250,000 rows. It's a big file with countif functions within the C column. Each of these rows contain these count-in functions. And when you press this button, the Excel file measures the time the system takes to process all these functions, all 250,000 functions. So a little explanation of these functions. What this cell does is that it looks through previous rows to see if there are any rows with the same combination of account and line of business. And if there is a row with the same combination of account and line of business, it returns a 0. If not, it returns a 1. So for example, in cell C18, it looks through the previous row to see if there is an account 17 and line of business 4. And as you can see here, there are none. So it returns a 1. Let's look at another example that returns 0. So if you look at this example, it looks through previous rows to see if there are rows with account 15 and line of business 2. And there is one here on row 16. So it returns a 0. And as you progress through these rows, it takes longer for the system to process since there are more rows to look through as you go down the rows. Okay, so this task measures the brute processing power of the systems. Okay, so we have the M1 MacBook Air within the Parallels desktop virtual PC environment, running on 6 cores and 12 gigs of RAM. I'll start the benchmark now. It's running with 6 cores. Next, I'm going to go into MacBook Pro 16 inches, the remote desktop. It's a Mac OS. I'm going to try this. Okay, it can't run. So this is the reason why Pro users prefer to use the Windows version since some features like macros does not run on the macOS version of the Excel. I'm going to run this again within Boot Camp on my MacBook Pro 16 inches. Next, I have the Cloud PC running in the Microsoft Azure platform. It's running on 2 Xeon processor cores and 8 gigs of RAM. I'll start this now. It's using all of its CPU cores, but it's not using all of its RAM, probably because it's being bottlenecked by the number of cores available. I think to run this benchmark effectively, you need to have at least 4 cores running. Okay, within the Microsoft Azure platform Cloud PC running on 2 CPU cores with 8 gigs of RAM, it took 2040 seconds. And on the M1 MacBook Air, within the Parallels virtual PC environment running on 6 cores and 12 gigs of RAM, it took 472 seconds. And within the MacBook Pro 16 inches running within native Windows 10 environment with 8 cores and 32 gigs of RAM, it took 179 seconds. Okay, here are the benchmark results. Let's first talk about MacBook Pro 16 inches. It simply failed to run within the macOS environment. Next, when I ran it in Parallels with 4 cores and 12 gigs of RAM, it took 304 seconds. And when I ran it through Boot Camp, a native Windows 10 environment with 8 cores and 32 gigs of RAM, it completed the benchmark in 179 seconds, which was a 41% uplift when running it under Parallels. This result is comparable to a desktop AMD 3700X. It's a little slower, but it's comparable to a desktop CPU. These 4 results, these 4 configurations, I did not run the benchmarks myself. These results were provided for me within the Excel sheet itself, as you can see here. These results were provided within the Excel sheets. I simply copied and pasted over the results onto this Excel sheet. Let's talk about the M1 MacBook Air. When I ran it with 4 gigs of RAM within the Parallels desktop virtual environment, it simply failed to run whether I ran it with 4 cores or 7 cores. It simply could not load up the Excel file. Okay. When I ran it with 4 cores and 8 gigs of RAM, it ran it in 578 seconds. And when I increased the RAM to 12 gigs of RAM, it ran within 580 seconds. There was a negligible difference between the 2 configurations. When I increased the core count to 5 with 12 gigs of RAM, there was a 10% increase within the performance. And every time I increased the number of core count, it increased the performance by 10%. So all in all, when I increased the cores from 4 to 7 cores, the performance improved by 27%. The Azure Cloud PC ran the benchmark at a dismal 2040 seconds. That's around 30 minutes. So what's the conclusion? Yes, the M1 MacBook Air within the Windows 10 Parallels environment is definitely a viable solution for using Excel. It's definitely usable, but I would definitely wait for the next generation Apple Silicon laptop if you're working with Excel files with big data sets. The performance is comparable to, I would say, a Core i5 6th generation 7300U, which here, it ran the test within 442 seconds, which is comparable to when running it with 7 cores with the M1 MacBook Air. When I worked within corporate finance, I used an Ultrabook laptop with Core i5 8th gen quad-core CPU. It was an A350U laptop. I used LG Gram. According to this benchmark, the A350U is approximately 20% faster for workstation workloads. Okay? Just like the macro file used today, I remember working with Excel files that had thousands of rows with many complex nested functions that combine VLOOKUP, if-then statement, match functions, etc. And those files really push the limits of the CPU performance. Okay, so if an 8th gen quad-core CPU was borderline usable within corporate finance settings, I would say that the M1 chip performance within the virtual Parallels environment, which is on par with the 7th generation dual core CPU is like usable, but be prepared to wait a long time for big Excel files to load with big dataset and many functions. So in conclusion, can you do real work on M1 chip within the Parallels environment on the Excel, Windows version of Excel? For everyday users, definitely yes. But if you're a heavy user, just think of yourself of using an Ultrabook from 2017. So this 7th generation Kaby Lake core was released in 2017, and if you look up on eBay, you have several laptops that cost around $300, right? So you're using a $300 laptop to do your work on Excel. So in conclusion, what will I do? Unfortunately, I will have to return this M1 MacBook Air and wait for the 14-inch variant with several more cores that will be released later on in Q4 of 2021. I will continue to use my I will continue to use my iPad to connect it to my MacBook Pro 16-inch remotely when it's resource-intensive applications like Excel. And one other note is that when I ran the Parallels software on the MacBook Air, I noticed that it used quite a lot of power. You use around it's right now using 3 watts. But when I use the benchmark Excel file, it used around 15 watts to 18 watts. So at that rate, it would use up the entire battery within 3 to 4 hours. So if you're doing anything intensive, resource intensive, expect the M1 MacBook Air's battery life to be around 3 to 4 hours. Okay, and I think that is a wrap. Hope it was helpful for you, and sorry for the quality. I'm in a cafe and I just decided to make this video on the fly for you guys. And that's all. Thank you for watching, and this was one. I'm out.